Hey there, this is Luke Maxfield with MedSchoolCoach. I'm a USMLE tutor for Step 2, 3, and a COMLEX tutor for 1, 2, and 3. So today, we're going to introduce ourselves to some basic concepts of statistics. A physician is in the process of developing a serologic test and determining the presence of sarcoidosis. While evaluating the study, serum levels of anti-X protein will be measured, and the presence of anti-X protein will be compared to tissue biopsies demonstrating non-caseating granulomas as the control. 200 patients were recruited, 120 had positive biopsy results. Anti-X protein was found in 80 patients with sarcoidosis and was positive in 15 patients without the disease. What is the specificity of the test? So this gives us a fairly straightforward vignette. Immediately we're given data, and we know we're going to be working with this data to grab the specificity. So initially we're going to build our 2x2 table, and then we're going to identify terms. So first off, what is the test of choice? And then what is the disease being evaluated? So the test here is this anti-X protein. So the first row is going to be test positive, and the bottom row will be for those patients who had a negative test result. Now the first column is for disease positive, so those patients who had biopsy-proven disease, and the second column is disease negative. Now pulling our numbers. So first of all, we had a total of 200 patients recruited. So we know that the sum of all of the patients is going to be 200. And 120 had positive biopsy results. So that's 120 patients who have the disease. So we're going to go to the disease positive column, and we'll know that the sum of this column is going to be 120. We see here that our test was found to be positive in 80 patients with sarcoidosis. So here the test was positive, which takes us to our first row, and the disease was positive, which takes us to our first column. That gives us 80. And then we have that the test was positive in 15 patients without the disease. So test was positive, first row. They did not have the disease. Takes us to the second column, disease negative. That puts us into 15. And then we have to identify how we get the rest of this information filled out so we can get the specificity. Let's turn this table into a more formal table. All right, so we have, again, the first row, which the test is positive. Second row, test is negative. And then we have the first column, disease positive. And the second column, disease negative. And then here we've also added in some other terms here. So we see that the sensitivity, as identified here by the first column, is a combination of the true positive divided by the true positive plus the false negative. The specificity, which is the feature we're interested in, is the second column, in which the true negative is divided by the true negative plus the false positive. Okay, let's plug in our numbers again. We said that the specificity was true negative divided by the quantity true negative plus false positive. So looking at this, we see that true negatives, those patients who had a negative test and had no disease, they're truly negative, divided by the quantity of true negative, so 65, plus the false positive. So that gives us 65 over 80, which gives us a value of 0.813. So really, these are fairly straightforward, and it relies heavily on your ability to put together this 2x2 table correctly. This is something that is extremely important because it's testable for all three steps. It's testable for the internal medicine and training exam, internal medicine boards, and it's even present and testable in some of the subspecialty in training and board exams. So taking a step back and looking at some of the other features of this test. Okay, let's look at some of the other answer choices. The sensitivity, which works out of the first column. So the sensitivity, conceptually, is looking at the disease first. If the patient has the disease, what's the likelihood that the test is going to capture that? So since we're looking at the disease first, we're going to be working out of the disease columns. This is true positive divided by the concept of true positive plus false negative. Here is 80 divided by the quantity 80 plus 40, which gives you a value of 0.666 or 0.67, as was the answer choice for A. The next one we'll say is what was for answer choice B, and that's the positive predictive value. So it works out of the first row. And the concept for a positive predictive value is if the patient has a positive test, the test being the first and foremost concept or part of this, if they have a positive test, what's the likelihood they actually have the disease? So since we're looking at the test first, we're going to go to the first test column, test positive column, and we're going to isolate the true positive divided by the quantity of true positive plus false negative, and that gave us 80 divided by the quantity 80 plus 15, and that gives us 0.84. Next is the negative predictive value. Again, if a patient has a negative test, what's the likelihood that they do not have the disease? So we're looking at the test first. We're in the second row. Here we're taking the number of true negative. So one thing that people get stumped up on is we're usually working left to right, top to bottom. But here, we're starting with true negatives. So true negative, 65 divided by the quantity of true negative plus false negative. So 65 divided by the quantity 65 plus 40, which gives you a value of 0.619 or 0.62. And then specificity, like we'd already calculated. So specificity, if the patient has the disease, what's the likelihood they're going to have a positive test result? We're looking at disease first with specificity, and we're going to have to work top to bottom. So the specificity, taking a true negative divided by true negative plus false positive. This gave us our value of 0.81. Another way I tried to keep these straight for myself in my mind is that to be sensitive to people, you generally have to be kind of positive so that you don't get them upset. So sensitivity works out of the disease positive column. To be specific, if I'm going to be specific with you, I might need to be critical of you. I might need to be negative to give you some specific feedback. So with that, I know that with specificity, you're going to be working out of the disease negative column. There's some simple tricks to make sure you can keep it straight and recall things quickly on test day. And then the other fifth answer choice here was just an arbitrary number that you can calculate later, and we can go through it another time, but relative risk, which is a combination of a similar 2x2 table. So sensitivity is the percent of patients with the disease who will test positive. And a good example of this for the real world is lupus. So highly sensitive test for a patient with lupus is the ANA, the anti-nuclear antibodies. So if a patient has lupus, we know they're highly likely to have a positive ANA. Now, the opposite is true for specificity. The percentage of people without the disease who will test negative. So highly specific test for lupus is an anti-Smith or anti-double-stranded DNA. So if patients who do not have those diseases, in this case lupus, a patient who does not have lupus, it's highly likely that they will test negative for an anti-double-stranded DNA or anti-Smith antibody. Now, positive predictive values, we talked about if a patient has a positive test, the results of that are probably true, meaning that they have the disease. And a negative predictive value test is it's likely that if the test is negative, the patient does not have the disease. All right, I hope you enjoyed it. This was just an introduction to some simple terms and fundamentals of basic statistics. You'll use this frequently. Look forward to seeing you again.